Magnus Carlsen is quite possibly the deepest strategist the game of chess has ever known. And this game is an example of that. He's going up against Peter Lecko. Now, Peter Lecko was known as being an incredibly hard player to beat. He was an elite player, even a world championship candidate. And among his peers, they could get draws against him, but to actually defeat him was very, very challenging. This game was played in 2009 at the Nanjing Pearl Spring, and there's actually only 10 points separating them in the rating at this time. Magnus was 2772, Lecko was 2762. So Magnus has the white pieces, Lecko has the black pieces, and watch how the depth of Magnus's strategy is so effective in this game against a strong player. E4 from Magnus, E5 from Peter Lecko, knight F3, knight C6, and here maybe the first surprise, D4, or the Scotch game. Now this opening is about as old as chess itself, but it was Kasparov who brought it back into prominence at the highest level. Pawn takes, knight takes, and we see White has quickly freed his position and has a comfortable development, but Black sort of does too. Black normally, well, there are a lot of different moves. He can play knight to f6, but here Lecko plays bishop to c5, attacking that knight a second time. White has to do something about that, and Magnus chooses the option bishop to e3 to directly defend the knight and to not move it. Lecko plays queen to f6, attacking the knight a third time, and so now it's possible to play a move like knight to b5. That's a little tricky, but Magnus just plays the solid c3. That does take away the most natural square of the b1 knight, but it also creates a lot of sturdiness in the center of the board. Now, Grandmaster Lecko plays knight g to e7 here, and you'll notice he is not falling behind in development at the moment. He has 4 pieces developed, and White only has 2, and he can castle immediately. The problem, though, is that White has this e4 pawn, so Magnus controls more central space, and his pawn structure is a little more powerful at the moment. Black might want to play a quick d5 to liquidate that center and liberate this bishop at c8. So Magnus plays bishop to c4. That controls the d5 square, develops the bishop. Now knight to e5, pushing that bishop around. The bishop comes back to e2 in this case. He doesn't want to go to b3 here. That's an okay square also. Either way, Black would probably play the next move, queen to g6. So Grandmaster Peter Lecko is hitting the g2 pawn and the e4 pawn. It's a double attack. What Magnus does is he castles. That covers the g2 pawn, but it leaves the e pawn hanging. But that's a very dangerous pawn to take, and White usually does very well when Black takes that pawn. After knight to d2, say queen to g6, bishop to h5, harassing that queen, and White gets a very nice position after, say, the queen coming back to d3, just knight 4 to f3, and there's quite a lot of pressure here. The knight aims here, the bishop here, and if Black were to play the simple move, knight takes knight, then actually queen to f3 would be the surprising response, with the queen threatening f7 with check, and also bishop to c5. White is doing very well there. So Grandmaster Lecko plays more circumspectly with d6. I hope I used that word correctly. Just allowing this bishop at c8 to get out. But Magnus plays f4. He wants to use these pawns aggressively to press in the center and attack on the king side. Here, Black can play knight to g4. That's playable, but after bishop takes, whether Black takes with the queen or the bishop, White will probably play queen to d3 and is in a position after, say, knight d2 to use this formation to attack. So instead, Black takes on e4. Now he takes the pawn, but he is, obviously his knight is under attack, but he's threatening the dark squared bishop on e3, and that's a more valuable piece. So Magnus protects that piece by playing it to f2. It looks like the f4 pawn is hanging, but if that pawn is taken, the problem is knight to b5 is really bad news for Black, threatening knight c7 check, forking the king and the rook, and there are threats of discoveries with bishop takes c5. If the bishop takes, the rook takes, then the queen is hanging as well as the pawn. So that pawn is not one that Black wants to take. So he takes the knight, instead. With the bishop, Magnus retakes with the pawn. And we notice that the role of the development has sort of shifted. Now Magnus is castle, black is not, and white is doing fine in the area of development, although black does have a pawn here. So knight to g6. Now this is where the real depth of Magnus's strategy comes to play. And watch how he plays against these two knights, how he limits their scope. First of all, he plays g3, creating a strong point here on f4, greatly limiting the knight on g6. The only square it can go to at the moment is f8, which is not too impressive. And after he's neutralized this knight, he's going to work on this knight at e7. So black castles. Now knight to c3. Hits the queen with tempo. The queen goes to the most natural square, f5, but that's also a square this knight might want to land on. So now his next move, boom, d5. That neutralizes the e7 knight, taking away a valuable square. So now both of these knights have very little scope. So he's playing against those pieces. He's down a pawn, but he really is neutralizing Grandmaster Lecko's pieces. So a6 from black. He knows this c7 pawn is a real weakness. White would like to play knight to b5 and maybe take that pawn. a6 keeps the knight out of the b5 square. Rook to e1, rook to the open file. And now king to h8. A strange move, but he has to do something to free up these knights. So by playing king to h8, the knight at e7 can go to g8 and redevelop at f6. Rook to c1, pressing on that c7 pawn weakness. Bishop to d7, bishop to f3, just solidifying the d5 pawn, and also the bishop can tuck back to g2 and keep his king safe. Rook a to c8, defending that pawn directly, but now queen to b3. Magnus attacks the b7 pawn, and the rook doesn't want to go to b8 because then the c pawn would hang again. So Grandmaster Lecko plays b5, but that leaves a weakness at c6. Now, we could say, well, that weakness is covered twice at the moment with the knight at e7 and the bishop d7, but it'll be very hard to keep those pieces there and keep that square protected. Knight to e2, immediately aiming at that square, the idea of knight to d4, and it would hit the queen on the way there, and maybe landing on c6 at some point. The queen goes to h3, the knight to d4, and now bishop to g4. Peter Lecko is trying to get in on the king side and create some problems. He would love to trade off that light-squared bishop, not only taking away the bishop pair advantage, but being able to exploit light-squared weaknesses in white's position. Magnus, of course, avoids that. Queen to h5. A very fascinating move here. This, to me, is very much, you have to be very strong to make a move like this. Very strong. h4, creating this barrier on the dark squares. But this structure has a fragility to it also, that it could be vulnerable to sacrifices. So only a player that knew exactly how to calculate would want to play a move like this. Knight goes to g8, rerouting to f6, as we discussed, but that leaves the c6 square vulnerable, and boom, immediately. Rook to c6 from Magnus, aiming at that a6 pawn. Black doesn't even worry about that. He knows he's not going to win a grind here. Either he has to win in an attack or he's going to lose. So he just develops the knight. The rook takes a6. Bishop back to d7. Defends the pawn, even though it's attacked twice. And Magnus does take the pawn. But rook to b8. Attacks the knight a second time. Now, it is easily defended with a4, but perhaps he's hoping this will help at least neutralize white's queenside play a little bit, this pin. But here come the dangerous threats. This is where a mere mortal might collapse. Grandmaster Lecko plays knight to g4. That's the beginning of some real serious trouble for white, if he is not careful. First, Magnus plays bishop to f3, pinning the knight to the queen. Now queen to h6, moving out of the pin. Now, black has a very serious threat here. He's threatening to take on f2 and then on f4, and that could really devastate white's position. If it were black's move here, for example, knight takes f2, king takes f2, knight takes f4, and black would be in very good shape. The knight could not be taken because of this move, queen to h4 check. And the threats here with this rook at e1 only defended by the king, black would actually just be completely winning here if the king went to f1, bishop to h3 check. And the king gets pushed away, and the rook would fall. And if the king were to go to e2, then it would just be a rook check, and he would pick up a rook that way. So how does Magnus deal with this threat of knight takes f2 followed by knight takes f4? Queen to c4. A multi-purpose move, of course. He's applying pressure to c7, but he's also defending the f-pawn laterally with the queen. So black decides, okay, well, I'll sack it on a different square. Knight takes h4. And again, it would be a terrible mistake to take the knight, because then knight f2, king f2, queen to h4 check, and we're in the same exact situation as we were before, where white would lose if king e2, then just check. Either way, he's going to lose there. So what Magnus does is, first he takes the knight at g4. Now that knight cannot take this bishop at f2, and he's able to keep some strength on the dark squares. Bishop takes g4 and gh4. So now, Grandmaster Lecco does have pressure on the light squares, but he only has 2 pieces. So if Magnus can keep those 2 pieces from delivering mate, be in good shape. Bishop to f3, simply threatening queen g6 followed by queen to g2 mate. So f5, keeping the queen from delivering check on the g file. The pawn controls g6. Queen to h5, directly attacking the f5 pawn. Queen to f4 defends it. Bishop takes that d5 pawn, but now knight takes c7, counterattacks the bishop. The bishop moves to b7, hitting the rook. The rook could take the pawn at d6, but Magnus just goes ahead and plays rook to b6. He would like to trade pieces because he knows the endgame is winning for him. f6 to allow the queen to get back into position. What it seems he wants to do here is create a battery on this long diagonal, maybe with a move with an idea of queen f7, queen to d5 once this knight at c7 is gone. So bishop to d4, queen to f7, hits the knight comes to e6, that now weak square because of the move f6. Hits the rook. Rook to g8, perhaps with the possibility of opening up the g file to attack white's king. So Magnus just steps to the side. Rook b to c8, threatening a check on c2. He just blocks it with bishop c3. Bishop to d5. This is actually supporting the rook entering the attack. Very few people, by the way, could withstand this kind of attack from black. Very few. Magnus ignores it. Just plays a5. Rook to c4 hits the queen. Magnus does not move the queen, just plays knight to d4. Now bishop to a8 from black, threatening queen to d5 and maybe creating some trouble along this long diagonal. So what does Magnus do? Just takes the pawn at d6. The goal is not primarily the pawn, though. It's to keep the queen out of d5, which he has now succeeded in doing. The queen can't go to d5 or to b7. So he plays queen to h5, now threatening to take on h4 with check. Just queen to f4, defending both the f5 pawn and the h4 pawn. Rook c to c8, and rook b to e6. And in this position, Grandmaster Lecco resigned, realizing that all of his attempts to get into white's position just have come to naught, and that Magnus will easily win with his pawns on the queen side. Truly a brilliant game from Magnus Carlsen. The depth of the strategy of keeping those knights contained, combined with his incredible defense against all those attacking ideas, I think we know why he reached the highest rating in chess history. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.